Grylls. Chapter 6. This is the longest one. It's the longest chapter I've read so far. So let's get going. Chapter 6. I remember vividly as a young teenager finding an old photograph of my father from when he was 17 and a fresh-faced Royal Marines commando. He looked just like me, but much smarter and with a parting in his hair. Next to his photograph is the album. In the album was a shot of him ice climbing with his fellow Marines on the north face of Ben Nevis in winter, a treacherous place to be if things go wrong. I asked him about the climb. And he told me how a rock fall had almost killed him outright that day, when a boulder the size of a basketball had been dislodged 200 feet above him. It had missed his head by less than a foot and smashed into 1,000 tiny rock fragments just below him on a ledge. He felt he had been handed his get out of jail free card that day, a moment of grace and good fortune. He always told me, never depend on those luck moments. They are gifts, but instead always build your own backup plan. I use that thinking a lot in my job nowadays. Thanks, Dad. If you can read this from the other side, as a young boy I used to love any trips away with him, whether it was galloping along a beach in the Isle of Wight with me behind him, or climbing on the steep hills and cliffs around the island's coast. It was at times like these that I found a really closeness with him. It was also where I learned to recognize the tightening sensation deep in the pit of my stomach as being a great thing to follow in life. Some call it fear. I remember the joy of climbing with my dad in the wintertime. It was always an adventure and often turned into much more than just a climb. Dad would decide that not only did we have to climb a sheer 150-foot chalk cliff, but also that German paratroops held the high ground. We therefore had to climb the cliff silently and unseen, and then fight the German fire position once at the summit. In reality, this meant lobbing clumps of manure forwards a deserted bench off the cliff tops. Brilliant. What a great way to spend a wet and windy winter's day when you are aged 8 or 28 for that matter. I loved returning from the cliff climbs totally caked in mud, out of breath, having scared ourselves a little. I learned to love that feeling of the wind and rain blowing hard on my face. It made me feel like a man when in reality I was only a little boy. We also used to talk about Mount Everest as we walked across the fields towards the cliffs. I loved to pretend that some of our climbs were on the summit face of Everest itself, and we would move together cautiously across the white chalk faces, imagining they were really ice. I had this utter confidence that I would climb Everest if my dad was beside me. These were powerful, magical times, bounding intimate fun, and I miss them a lot. Even today, how good it would feel to get the chance to do that with him just once more. Every time I fell off in the wet sand and was on the verge of bursting into tears, Dad would applaud me and say, "That that I was slowly becoming a horseman. In other words, you can't become a decent horseman until you fall off and get up again a good number of times. There's life in a nutshell. On one occasion we were on Dartmoor, a wild part of the UK in all seasons, and we're staying at a small inn, walking and riding each day. It was in the depth of winter with snow on the ground, and I could remember how freezing cold it was every day. My young, boyish face felt as if it was literally about to freeze solid. I couldn't feel the end of my nose at all, which for someone with a big one like myself, even age 10, was a scary new physical phenomenon. I started to cry. That usually worked to show Dad that things were serious and needed his attention. But he just told me to cover up better and push through it. So I shut up. And he was right, and I felt proud to have endured in my own little way. I had a real goal to own my own speedboat one day, to be able to drive around in it and to tinker with the engine. Obviously a real speedboat was out of the question, but instead I got to build one with my dad, a very cool little 8 feet wooden rowing boat with a 1.5 HP, 1.5 horsepower engine on the back. The boat was barely fast enough to make any progress against the incoming tides, but it was perfect for me. I loved the time along, just nature and me, but only as long as I had the safety net of knowing that Dad was nearby on hand to help in a crisis, which was often the case. As I felt on top of the world, as I sailed back into harbour drenched like a drowned rat, it was a feeling that I could be a little different from everyone else at my age, and that if pushed, I could battle against the forces of nature and prevail. Adventure felt the most natural thing in the world, and it was where I came alive. It is what made me feel, for the first time, really myself. In short, when I was wet, muddy and cold, I felt $1 million, and when I was with the lads, with everyone desperately trying to be cool, I felt more awkward and unsure of myself. I could do mud, but trying to be cool was never a success. So I learned to love the former and shy away from the latter. Instead, I would often dress up in my worst and dirtiest clothes, stand under the hosepipe in the garden, get soaking wet in December, and then go off for a run on my own in the hills. The locals thought me a bit bonkers, but I loved it. It felt wild, and it was a feeling that captured me more and more. Once I returned from one such run, caked in mud, and ran past a girl I quite fancied. I wondered if she might like the muddy look. Instead, she crossed the road very quickly, looking at me as if I was just weird. It took me a while to begin to learn that girls don't always like people who are totally scruffy and covered in mud, and what I consider natural raw and what I didn't necessarily equal sexy. Lesson still in progress. See you tomorrow.